Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France, I want to know. Don't just sit back and tell me where in the world you are. Now let's dive into the story. The saloon was dead quiet when Clemence spoke. Her voice shook, but the words hit like a gunshot. Did she really do that to her father? Her eyes, sharp as steel under the low lantern light, cut through the smoke-filled room. The men at the card table froze, their cards trembling in their hands. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, carrying dust across the street. Nobody wanted to answer her. Nobody even dared to breathe. The shame in the room was heavy, like the air before a storm. Clemence was no fragile flower. 24, tall and wiry from years of ranch work, she wore her brown hair in a tight braid, a weathered leather coat over a simple linen dress. Her green eyes, those piercing French green eyes, never blinked as she looked around the room. She was demanding the truth, and the truth was poison. Everyone knew it. Everyone had seen what Adelaide had done. But saying it out loud was different. The sheriff shifted in his chair, boots scraping the wooden floor. His name was Baptiste Roche, a man past 50 with graying hair and scars from too many gunfights. He had seen shootouts, robberies, and murders, but even he hesitated now. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. Because admitting the truth would tear the town apart. It was not just about what Adelaide had done. It was about who her father was. The silence became unbearable. Clemence's voice cracked again, stronger this time. Answer me. She slammed her hand against the bar, rattling empty glasses. Faces turned away. Mothers looked down. Even the bartender, a heavy-set man named Augustine, wiped the counter nervously, pretending not to hear. No one wanted to carry that burden. No one wanted to put words to the betrayal that had already burned the town to ash inside. Finally, when the silence grew too heavy, Clemence made her choice. She turned, her braids snapping against her back, and stormed out of the saloon. Her boots struck the wooden floor like gunshots, and the door slammed behind her. The wind swallowed her up as she disappeared into the night, leaving the room frozen in shame. Nobody followed her. Nobody could. Because if what she said was true, then everything they thought they knew about family, loyalty, and blood had already been shattered. The night air outside the saloon was colder than Clemence expected. The desert could burn your skin in the day, but when the sun dropped, the wind cut like glass. She wrapped her coat tighter and walked fast down the dusty street. Her boots kicked up little clouds with each step. She didn't look back. She couldn't. Inside, their silence had been worse than a bullet. It confirmed what she feared, what everyone already knew but dared not say. Adelaide had turned against her own father. And not just with words. With something far darker. As she passed the shuttered storefronts, Clemence saw the faint glow of the church lantern. Its door creaked, left ajar. For a heartbeat, she considered stepping inside, confessing her doubts to Father Jerome. But she stopped. She couldn't bear the weight of another man's judgment. Faith was not enough here. This wasn't sin that could be prayed away. This was betrayal that tore families apart. And Clemence had known betrayal before. She had watched her own father, Etienne Valois, die at the hands of men who once swore loyalty to him. She knew the taste of blood mixed with lies. The memories clawed back. She had been just 16, hidden in the loft of the barn when gunfire erupted. Her father had staggered into the dirt, clutching his side. His best friend, a man named Henri Beaumont, stood over him with a smoking pistol. She had covered her mouth to keep from screaming as Henri spat on her father and walked away, leaving him to bleed into the soil. That was the day Clemence promised herself she would never let betrayal go unanswered. She had lived with that vow burning inside her every day since. Now, years later, she saw the same shadow falling over this town. Adelaide, sweet-faced Adelaide with her honey blonde hair and voice like a lullaby, was no longer the innocent daughter people believed. Whispers had turned into truths. She had stood against her own father, François Dupré, the rancher who fed half the county with his cattle. No one would say exactly what she had done, but Clemence had seen François' face at the last market. Hollow, ashamed, and broken. A man who had built his life with his bare hands, undone not by strangers but by blood. Clemence reached the edge of town where the prairie stretched wide and endless. The moon painted silver lines across the grass. She stopped, breathing hard, and clenched her fists. Her thoughts spiraled between past and present, her father and François, herself and Adelaide. Patterns repeated in this land like storms. Betrayal always came from the ones closest, and silence always made it worse. She looked back at the faint lanterns of the saloon in the distance. Inside, they would go on drinking, pretending not to know, hoping secrets could rot quietly without consequence. But she knew better. Secrets never stayed buried. Dawn broke over St. Vincent like fire spilling across the plains. The light stretched long over the roofs, catching every crack in the old wooden beams. Clemence hadn't slept. She sat outside her small cabin on the edge of town, her braid loosened, her eyes burning from the night's thoughts. The words from the saloon haunted her. Did she really do that to her father? They echoed louder than gunfire, louder than any church bell. Because if no one else would speak the truth, then it meant it was up to her. But what if she was wrong? What if her anger blinded her the way grief once had? Her hands rested on her lap, scarred from years of work. She looked at them as if they held answers. Once, these hands had pulled her father's body from the dirt, clutching him while the blood soaked her dress. She remembered the weight of him heavier than stone, heavier than guilt. She had been a child, yet the world had forced her to carry death. Now, as a woman, the world demanded she carry the truth. Her father's ghost whispered behind her eyes, "Do not let silence win." The town came alive slowly. Wagons rolled out. Children ran barefoot to the schoolhouse. A few men, still drunk from last night, staggered past her cabin, tipping their hats half-heartedly. But even in their voices she heard the hush. Everyone knew. Everyone carried the same weight. She saw it in the way mothers pulled their daughters close, in the way men looked at the ground instead of meeting each other's eyes. It was as if the whole town lived under a shadow that none dared to name. Adelaide's betrayal wasn't just her family's shame. It had become St. Vincent's curse. Clemence stood, brushing the dust from her skirt. She could not let this rot spread. She thought of François Dupré, the father, the rancher, once proud and unbreakable. He had looked at her last week at the market, but it wasn't a look of greeting. It was a plea. Silent, desperate. A man drowning without words. If no one else would speak, then she must. She tied her braid back tight, pulled her coat on, and headed down the street toward the Dupré ranch. Each step felt like stepping closer to fire. But before she reached the gates, a voice stopped her. "Clemence." She turned to see Lucien Morel, the blacksmith, his broad frame blocking the morning sun. His arms were black with soot, his jaw lined with stubble, his blue eyes troubled. He lowered his voice as if afraid the grass itself might be listening. "Don't do this. Don't go to François. You'll tear open wounds that never heal." His words were steady, but his eyes betrayed fear. Fear not for her safety but for the truth itself. That's when she realized, some people weren't silent out of shame. They were silent out of terror. And if Lucien, the strongest man in town, was afraid, then what Adelaide had done was worse than she ever imagined. The Dupré ranch stood like a fortress at the edge of the valley, its fences stretching wide, holding back hundreds of cattle that moved like a restless tide. The house itself, built of pale stone and dark timber, carried the pride of generations. But as Clemence approached, she felt no pride here, only sorrow. The shutters were half closed, the yard quiet, the air thick with the smell of dust and silence. A dog barked once, then whimpered as if it had been commanded not to speak. She tightened her coat around her shoulders, her boots crunching on gravel, and knocked on the heavy door. It was François Dupré himself who opened it. The man looked smaller than she remembered, though his shoulders were still broad, his frame strong. His once black hair had turned almost entirely gray, and his eyes, once sharp as a hawk's, were dulled with something darker than age. For a long moment he just stared at her, his lips trembling but silent. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. "Why have you come, Clemence?" She wanted to answer with strength, but her heart cracked at the sound of him, this man who had taught half the town how to ride, who had given her father work when they had nothing. "I need to know," she said. Her voice shook, but she held his gaze. "What they whisper in the saloon, in the market, is it true? Did Adelaide, your daughter, do something to you?" The words cut like a blade between them. François stepped back, letting her in. She walked into the parlor, once filled with laughter and warmth, now heavy with shadows. The curtains blocked the morning light, and the only sound was the slow tick of the clock on the mantel. François lowered himself into a chair, his hands trembling as he rubbed his temples. "They don't know what they speak of," he whispered. "They don't know half of it." He paused, his chest heaving as if each word cost him breath. "Adelaide was my pride. My girl with golden hair, my reason for working these lands." His voice cracked. "But pride blinds a man. I gave her everything, and in return she—" He stopped, his jaw tightening. Clemence leaned closer, her heart pounding. She felt the air grow colder, as if the house itself didn't want these words spoken aloud. "She betrayed me," he said at last, his voice breaking. Not with knives or bullets. Worse. She took what was mine, the ranch, the accounts, the men who worked for me. She turned them all against me. My own daughter made me a stranger in my own house. He looked up at Clemens, his eyes red, his voice trembling with humiliation. And I let her. Because I couldn't raise my hand against my blood. His words hit her harder than any confession of murder could have. Adelaide hadn't killed him. She had taken his life in another way. She had stripped him of his name, his authority, his dignity. To a man like Francois Dupré, that was a death worse than the grave. Clemens had barely drawn breath after Francois's confession when the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Light, steady, almost musical. And then she appeared. Adelaide Dupré stepped into the parlor like a queen returning to her throne. Her golden hair caught the dim light, glowing against the gloom. She wore a pale dress of cream cotton, cinched with a brown leather belt, and though simple, it seemed to shine on her as if no dust of this land could cling to her. Her face, soft and angelic, held no sign of guilt. Her lips curled into the faintest smile when her eyes met Clement's, though the smile did not touch her eyes. "Well," Adelaide said, her voice calm, almost playful. "It seems our visitor has come to hear the tales for herself." She glanced at her father, whose jaw tightened, though he did not rise from his chair. Clemens froze for a moment, struck by the strange power in the young woman's presence. She had known Adelaide as a child, always gentle, always polite. Yet now, standing before her, she felt something colder than a woman who knew her strength, and who had no fear of using it. "Adelaide," Clemens said, her voice firmer than she felt, "the town speaks of betrayal. I didn't believe it. But your father says you've taken everything from him." She expected defensiveness, denial, maybe even tears. Instead, Adelaide tilted her head as though considering a game. "Taken?" she repeated softly, her tone smooth as silk. "No, Clemens. I've claimed what was already mine. My father built this ranch, yes. But I kept it alive when his hands grew weak, when his decisions faltered. I saved it from ruin. Would you call that betrayal or survival?" Her words slipped into the room like smoke, impossible to ignore. Francois slammed his fist against the armrest, his voice rising. "Survival? You call turning my men against me survival? You call forging my name in contract survival? You, my own daughter, robbed me while I breathed." His voice cracked, and his hand trembled as it pointed at her. But Adelaide did not flinch. Instead, she stepped closer, her eyes burning, though her smile remained calm. "And you call letting our debts drown us leadership? You call drinking in silence while the ranch fell apart honor?" She turned to Clemens now, her words sharp. "Tell me, Clemens, what's worse? A father's pride or a daughter's resolve?" The silence that followed was unbearable. Clemens' chest rose and fell quickly, her heart trapped between two truths that seemed equally cruel. She looked from the broken man in the chair to the radiant figure standing above him. The air in the parlor seemed to grow thicker, the ticking of the clock louder, sharper, as if the house itself held its breath. She realized then what the town had failed to see. This wasn't just betrayal. It was war, father against daughter, blood against blood, and the battlefield was not land or cattle, but dignity itself. And Clemens, whether she wanted it or not, was now standing at the center of it. By morning, the town of St. Remy buzzed like a disturbed hive. Whispers carried through the dusty streets faster than the wind. Children ran barefoot, repeating what they'd overheard from their parents. Adelaide betrayed Francois, and Francois cursed his own blood. At the bakery, Madame Rousseau slammed down loaves harder than usual, muttering that a daughter should honor her father. Across the square, Baptiste the blacksmith told anyone who would listen that the ranch would have died years ago if not for Adelaide's sharp mind. Everyone had an opinion and none matched. The air felt charged, as though one spark might set the whole town ablaze. Clemens felt it first when she walked to the well. A cluster of women stopped talking the instant she approached. Their eyes followed her, sharp and questioning. "You were at the Dupré house," one finally said, folding her arms. "You heard the truth. Tell us, Clemens. Who's right?" The question stung because she didn't know. She saw Francois's broken spirit, but also Adelaide's fire. She saw love twisted into something unrecognizable. Clemens shook her head, her voice low. "I only heard pain. Nothing else." That answer satisfied no one. The men in the saloon debated louder. Some slammed their cups and swore that loyalty to Francois was loyalty to the old ways, honor, tradition, respect. Others raised their voices, insisting the ranch was the heartbeat of the valley and that Adelaide had kept it alive when no one else could. The debate turned into shoves into fists. By sundown, two men staggered bleeding into the street, while the sheriff tried to restore calm. "This family storm is not your fight," he roared. But the town was already divided, and lines had been drawn in the dust. At the center of it all, Adelaide remained calm. She stood on the balcony of the ranch house, watching riders come and go, men loyal to her, men who had once answered Francois. She spoke to them softly, persuasively, promising wages paid on time, land managed with skill, debts kept at bay. They listened. They nodded. To them she wasn't a betrayer. She was a leader stepping into a void. Francois, meanwhile, stayed in his parlor, his voice hoarse, warning any who would hear him that his daughter's ambition would poison everything they'd built. But fewer people came to listen. Clemence watched this unfold with dread. She had not meant to step into their war, but now everywhere she went, people demanded her judgment. They wanted her to declare who was right, who was wrong. And though her heart pulled in two directions, she knew something deeper now. This fight was no longer just about a family. It was about power. Whoever the town chose would decide the future of Saint Remy itself. And Clemence feared that whichever side won, something precious would be lost forever. That evening, Clemence found herself walking the back trail that wound past the Dupré ranch. The sky burned in streaks of orange and violet, the kind of sunset that seemed too beautiful for a world tearing itself apart. Her boots crunched over gravel until she stopped by the barn. The place was nearly empty now, most of the ranch hands having left to choose sides in town. A single lantern swayed in the wind. That's when she saw it half buried in the dirt, the corner of an envelope, its paper yellowed, its seal cracked. Something about it drew her like a whisper. She bent, brushed the dust away and pulled it free. The handwriting was shaky, but she recognized it instantly, Francois Dupré. Inside was not a letter to his daughter, but a confession. Written years ago, never sent, never spoken. Francois admitted to debts that nearly destroyed the ranch, debts he had hidden by making dangerous bargains with men from across the border. Men who promised profit but demanded loyalty. Worse, he wrote of one decision that haunted him, forcing his wife, Adelaide's mother, to marry him out of duty rather than love. He admitted she had loved another, a quiet man named Lucien, whom Francois had driven out of Saint Remy with threats and shame. The letter ended with 5 words underlined twice. "I fear she knows now." Clemence's breath caught. Suddenly pieces fit where before they scattered. Adelaide's cold defiance wasn't just ambition, it was the wound of truth. She must have found this letter before. She must have carried the knowledge of her father's cruelty, the betrayal of her mother, and the corruption beneath his proud name. What looked like rebellion was something deeper, reckoning. For a moment, Clemence's chest ached. She had hated Adelaide for shaming her father, but now she wondered if shame had already been planted long ago by Francois himself. But then the wind shifted, and Clemence felt fear instead of pity. If this letter ever reached the wrong hands, Saint Remy would be torn to the bone. The Dupré name would crumble, the ranch would collapse, and men who had been promised loyalty from Francois would come collecting blood. Clemence folded the letter and tucked it inside her coat. She could not decide yet whether to burn it, hide it, or deliver it. All she knew was that this was dynamite in paper form, and her own hands had just lit the fuse. She turned back toward town as the last streaks of light died behind the hills. Her shadow stretched long, trembling across the ground. In the distance, the saloon lamps flickered alive, voices rising like storm clouds. Nobody knew yet what she carried. Nobody knew yet that the truth had been written long before Adelaide spoke her first word of defiance. And as Clemence walked, her heart whispered a single question. If she revealed this letter, would she be saving Saint Remy or destroying it? The house of the Duprés stood silent that night, shutters drawn tight against the wind. Inside, the air carried a weight, as though the very walls knew what Clemence now carried. She had slipped through the side door after most of the ranch hands had gone to their quarters. Her boots barely made a sound on the wooden steps as she climbed toward the attic. That was where Adelaide hid whenever the world pressed too hard on an attic smelling of dust, candle wax, and lavender that never quite faded. When Clemence reached the door, she pushed it open to find Adelaide sitting cross-legged by the window, the moon spilling silver over her face. She looked younger there, fragile even, until her eyes lifted and hardened the moment she saw Clemence holding the folded paper. Clemence didn't waste words. She placed the letter on the floor between them. "Your father wrote this," she said, her voice rough. Adelaide's eyes flicked to the envelope, then back to Clemence. For the first time she flinched. Slowly she picked it up, fingers trembling not with fear but recognition. She didn't read it and she didn't need to. Instead she let out a bitter laugh. "So it's come back," she whispered. "I thought I burned every trace. The attic went still except for the groaning of wood in the wind. Adelaide pressed the letter to her chest, her braid falling loose across her shoulder, her breathing sharp and uneven. Clemens leaned closer. "You knew. All this time." The words weren't accusation so much as astonishment. Adelaide's jaw tightened. "I knew since I was 16. My mother told me in pieces before she died. That letter only confirmed it. You see, Francois built his empire on chains of promises he broke, chains he forced others to carry. And he forced her to carry one too." Her voice cracked at the edge, but she steadied it quickly, like a blade finding its balance. "He told the town he married her out of honor, but he stole her from Lucien. My mother never smiled again after that." The moonlight carved lines of grief across her face, and suddenly her arrogance looked more like armor, a shell against wounds too deep to name. Clement's throat closed. She had come expecting lies, perhaps excuses, but not this naked pain. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" she asked, barely above a whisper. Adelaide's reply came fast, sharp, almost furious. "Because no one would have listened. They love his power, his cattle, his money. They love what he pretends to be. But me? I was only the daughter who spoke too loud. The daughter who didn't bow. To them that made me ungrateful. A traitor." She held up the letter, shaking it in the air like a torch. "This is the truth. But truth means nothing if people worship a lie." For a long moment they sat in silence, only the creak of the rafters above them. Then Clemence reached across, her hand firm on Adelaide's wrist. "Then let's make them listen," she said. Adelaide's eyes widened not with surprise, but with the weight of realizing she was no longer alone in her fight. The attic felt smaller, hotter, charged with something dangerous but undeniable. Clemence had entered with a letter. She left with a pact. By dawn, Francois Dupré knew something was wrong. His study door, usually locked, stood ajar. Papers were shifted, drawers not quite closed. The old man had lived long enough to sense when shadows moved where they should not. He lit a cigar, letting the smoke curl around his head as he sat heavily at the desk. Then he saw the empty corner where the letter had been hidden beneath ledger books. His jaw clenched. That letter was not just words on paper. It was a blade aimed at the heart of his empire. If the wrong hands held it, his house of power could collapse in a single whisper. He crushed the cigar into the ashtray and barked for his men. Lucien arrived first, pale eyes sharp under his wide hat. He could see the storm in Francois's face. "What's gone?" he asked. Francois pointed at the desk. "The letter. My confession. The one she should have never seen." Lucien stiffened. He knew at once who she meant. "Adelaide." His lips twisted. "Then she's moving against you." Francois slammed his fist on the wood. "She forgets who built this land. She forgets whose name shields her from wolves. But she'll remember. I'll make sure of it." His voice thundered like a hammer against stone. Meanwhile, Adelaide and Clemence rode together across the frostbitten fields outside St. Remy, their cloaks snapping in the wind. The letter lay in a leather pouch strapped to Adelaide's waist. For the first time in years, she felt a strange kind of strength not borrowed from her father's name, but earned by daring to defy it. Clemence rode beside her, silent but watchful, like a hawk circling the horizon. They both knew time was short. Francois's reach was long, and he would not rest until the letter was back in his possession. Still, there was a wild freedom in the gallop, as if the land itself wanted to see the truth come alive. Back at the estate, Francois gathered the ranch hands in the courtyard. His voice carried like a whip across the cold morning air. "Someone here has betrayed me. Someone has stolen from my blood." His eyes scanned their faces, fearful, uncertain, some loyal, some already whispering behind his back. "Bring me Adelaide," he ordered. "Alive if you can. Broken if you must. She will not shame my name again." The men shifted nervously, but Francois's shadow loomed too large for hesitation. Lucien saddled his horse first, smirking. He had waited years for this permission to hunt the girl who reminded him too much of the man who once stole his heart's desire. In town, rumors spread like wildfire. A missing letter. A daughter fleeing. A father's fury. The baker whispered it to the blacksmith, who told it to the innkeeper, who carried it to travelers over ale. By evening, St. Remy buzzed with speculation. Some said Adelaide had stolen money. Others swore she carried proof of a crime. And some, more daring, whispered that the sins of Francois Dupré were finally catching up with him. For the first time, people dared to imagine a St. Remy without its iron-fisted patriarch. The first snow of winter fell heavy on the ridges as Adelaide and Clemence pushed their horses harder through the pine-scented woods. Frost clung to their lashes, their breaths clouds of urgency in the air. Every hoofbeat sounded too loud, every snap twig a warning. Adelaide touched the pouch at her side where the letter lay hidden. She whispered to herself as if speaking to her late mother, "I won't let him bury the truth. Not again." Clement's sharp eyes scanned the tree line, her hand never straying far from the pistol holstered beneath her coat. They both knew Francois's men would not be far behind. The forest felt alive, holding its breath for the blood that might soon stain its snow. Behind them, Lucien led the hunt with a cruel grin. 6 men rode with him, rifles slung across their backs, eyes sharp with greed and loyalty to Francois's coin. Lucien's horse thundered forward as he raised a hand, signaling silence. He was no fool. He had tracked men through war and wilderness alike. He could feel her trail, see the broken branches, the faint indentations in the soil. "She thinks she can outrun me," he muttered, his voice low and jagged. "But a daughter who betrays her father always leaves pieces of herself behind." The men chuckled nervously, though one crossed himself, as if sensing the darkness coiling around Lucien's words. The first ambush came at the narrow gorge where 2 frozen cliffs funneled into a single path. Adelaide and Clemence barely slowed as shadows moved ahead. 3 riders burst from the rocks, rifles raised. "Stop there, girl," one barked, his breath a plume of white. Adelaide's heart hammered. For a moment she froze, her mind torn between terror and defiance. But Clemence's voice cut through like steel. "Ride!" She drew her pistol and fired, the shot exploding across the gorge. One man reeled back with a scream, clutching his arm. The others scrambled. The women's horses surged forward, hooves striking sparks against frozen stone as they barreled through the gap. Bullets whined off the cliffs behind them. Lucien heard the shots echo and his grin widened. "Good. Let her fight. Let her think she can win." He spurred his horse, his men following close behind, their shapes ghost-like through the falling snow. The chase had become a game now, and Lucien intended to savor every moment. He pictured Adelaide's face, pale and determined, so much like her mother's had once been. A twisted satisfaction burned in him. This was not just a hunt for a letter, but for vengeance long delayed. Francois had ordered capture, but Lucien? He craved the break in her spirit. He wanted to see the fire in her eyes snuffed out beneath his boot. As dusk settled, Adelaide and Clemence burst free of the gorge, their horses lathered with sweat and steam rising from their coats. The forest ahead opened into a frozen river, its surface glittering beneath the last bleeding light of the sun. They urged the horses onto the ice, praying it would hold. Behind them, the hunters poured from the gorge like wolves, their shouts and curses carried on the cold wind. Adelaide risked one glance back, and in that moment she saw Lucien's pale eyes fixed on her across the distance. Her chest tightened. She understood then this was no simple chase. This was war, and only one side would walk away alive.